Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Let's Talk Elephants. Today will mark our 6th episode of Season 3, which means that I have officially done 22 podcast episodes, and that totally blows my mind because it feels like all of this has moved past me very quickly. That also means that at the conclusion of today, we will only have 2 episodes left for the rest of the season, and I just want to thank anyone that has made it this far. Your support really does mean the world to me. Now on to today. My guest for this week is Jenny Farrell, and she's actually one of my old communication professors from UNLV. The reason that I asked her to come on the show today is because she has extensive experience both personally and professionally in the subject of long-distance relationships. This is one of those topics where I feel like everyone kind of gets their panties in a bunch when you bring it up because there's this pretty commonly accepted stigma that long-distance relationships just don't work. And I'm not entirely sure why we've accepted that as a cultural norm, but hopefully Jenny will be able to shed some light on the topic for all of you, whether you are fans of this type of relationship or not. So jumping right into it, Jenny, could you please just briefly introduce yourself and start by sharing what made you decide to study long-distance relationships in grad school?
Sure. And I'm super excited to be here, by the way. So my name is Jenny Farrell. I am a faculty member at UNLV in the Communication Studies Department, and I teach interpersonal communication courses. I've been here for over a decade now, and I love it.
Nice, yeah.
Yeah, and really how I got interested in interpersonal communication and particularly long-distance relationships is because I have lots and lots and lots of experience of being in just one. So I actually married my high school sweetheart. His name is Jason, and you know from all my classes that I talk about my relationship a lot.
Yes.
So we began long distance when I moved away for college and he joined the Air Force. So for, the 4 years that I was doing undergrad, he was away. So that was 4 solid years of living in very different places. And what I found to be really interesting was, A, he didn't want to do it. He thought, well, that'll never work, right? And B, nobody else thought it would work either. I was the only one that was like, what do you mean? Why is this a problem?
Yeah.
So that I think was an initial challenge. And after I graduated, we got married. We moved to Germany. We lived in Germany for a while. He was stationed there in the Air Force. So we had a good couple of years where we were for the most part together and living together. And then after he got out of the military is when we moved to Vegas, and we've lived here ever since. So he got a job as a contractor, which is basically like being in the military. You're just a civilian. So he was deploying a lot during that time, and he had that job for like 7 years. And, I was doing grad school and then got hired on as a faculty member. And then we started having kids. And so we've had a lot of years of being away, right? So even when he would deploy, he would be gone for 4, 5, 6 months at a time, with no visits during that. And then even after he quit that job and started his own small business. So now we are like around each other more than we ever have been. And it's been about 5 years now. And but even with that, we find that time apart is still really important for our relationship. So we do travel by ourselves. We go hang out with our friends by ourselves. He takes trips because he's on an off-road racing team. So there definitely are reasons why, we still have distance present in our life. But we've been together over 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was actually stationed in Germany in the Air Force, too.
Oh, really?
I didn't know that he was in
Yeah,
Germany.
we were in Ramstein. Do you know what base?
I
Okay.
don't. I'd have to ask him, but it was like in the 80s. Like
We loved it so much. Yeah.
Because you were out there for a while, right? Like
Yeah,
in Europe?
we were there for 3 years.
Okay, so you did live together when he was in the Air Force.
Yep.
So at what point? So when was it long distance? Was it long distance for that first 11 years?
So it was the first. Well, so we were together a couple years in high school, and then the whole 4 years that I was in college, we were long distance.
Okay.
So I was in Northern California at Humboldt State. He was in Washington, stationed at McCord for a while. He would TDY all over the place, so he was like in South Carolina a little bit. And then he went to Germany before I graduated.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then after you graduated is when you moved out to Germany?
Yeah, so then we lived together for a couple of years in Germany. And then once we came back is when more deployments started really happening. He didn't deploy much when we were in Germany.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And was he still deploying when you guys started having kids?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I had my son, Miles, who we named Miles because of long distance, right? Yeah. And he loves to tell that story.
Yeah.
So I had my son, Miles, and by the time he was like 2.5, my husband, Jason, had only been around half of his life. So like we added up the months away versus months home, and he missed out on about half of his life those first couple of years. And then when I got pregnant with my second child, that's when we decided we're not doing this anymore. Like it was more of him. He really struggled with being away from the kids when they're babies.
Right. How was being pregnant in a long distance relationship?
Well, I mean, I think like anything, it's a challenge, right? Like being pregnant, period, is a challenge.
Right.
So I think it was difficult, but it was so much a part of our life and our relationship that it didn't really bother me that much.
Yeah. Do you feel like you kind of just learned to be very independent and like not rely on him at all anyways?
Yeah. And I still don't.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So kind of like circling back to you being in grad school, what was like your specific thesis or your, I don't ever know if it's niche or niche.
Yeah.
But
I actually came here to Vegas because at the time we had a faculty member. Her name was Erin Salstein. She since has got married. So now she's Erin Salstein Parcell. And she was here and that's her area. And so I came to study under her. And she was my thesis advisor. And so my thesis was focused on what I called communication constraints in long distance romantic relationships. And so for me, I was really interested in investigating like, what's the struggle, right? Because my husband and I dealt with years of people not getting it, years of people asking us, how is this possible? How can you be successful? Because right now I'll tell you, like, it's very important and a really good thing in our relationship to have this. I don't think we would have been as happily married if we weren't long distance.
Yeah.
And so that was fascinating to me because I couldn't find a lot of people that shared my experience. So, you know, people in college, people in the military, there's tons of long distance relationships. I mean, you know, this was years ago, but it's more true now, right? And so I was interested in like, okay, well, why is it so hard? Why are people struggling so much in these kinds of relationships? And so that's really what I looked at.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The communication end of things.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What was like the most shocking thing that you discovered while you were studying this topic?
Yeah. So kind of the big picture that I took away from it was something that I called people's notion of distance. So what I think is really interesting is a lot of times our success in these kinds of relationships comes down to what you think about distance in the first place and how you view distance, right? So I think we exist in a culture that sees distance as being a bad thing, right? It has a lot of negative connotations. When you say that you need space from someone, they automatically assume it's a bad thing, right?
Right.
And I never saw it as such. I always thought it was a really good thing in all close relationships, really, right? And so that's what I found is that people who had this negative idea of what it meant to be long distance, people that see long distance relationships as inherently being harder or doomed or more difficult or whatever, tend to do the worse. So it kind of turns into this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Of I think it's going to be terrible, and so I communicate in ways that make it terrible, and then it is terrible, right? So it's not our fate for long distance relationships to fail. I think it's often how we kind of conceptualize them in the first place. And so once we kind of broke down, the people that think really positively about it have like a positive social network that support them and people that believe that they can do it. And they see all of the really great benefits of these kinds of relationships. They're the ones who are successful. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's like with anything.
Yeah.
It's just a mindset.
Absolutely.
Thing. So yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's interesting. I took a film class while I was here where we analyzed like horror genres. Uh-huh. So we had a whole genre where like a whole week where we studied like there was this movie called The Descent, and it was all about like this group of girls that were hikers, and they go and discover this like underground cave tunnel thing. Mm-hmm. And in our like research, we had to analyze all these words that have like negative connotations, like below and beneath and darkness and the descent. Like there's all these things that are talking about like just being underneath something, or and there's connotation,
which is like not as good,
right. So it's
lower.
Yes, right. So it's interesting to me to think about like distance, space.
That's exactly it.
Even from a pragmatic perspective, like having to travel is expensive. There's so many things. It costs you something to do that. They don't see it as something that's like
beneficial.
Yeah.
Right. And, you have to, a lot of people believe it takes like more work, right? More energy, more effort, more money to maintain these kinds of relationships.
Right. Is that true?
I personally don't think it's more work. I think it's a different kind of work.
Yeah.
But I also believe that a lot of the things that work really well in like our proximal or geographically close relationships work exactly the same way in our long distance relationships.
Right.
So I really believe they're not that different when it comes to maintaining them. I think they have special and unique benefits that other, more proximal relationships don't.
Right. So I feel like personally studying communications in college helped me so much to navigate like my own personal relationship.
Yeah,
I've been
totally
with bumps, obviously, but I've been with my boyfriend for 6 years. He's also in my high school.
Oh, wow.
So
that's exciting.
There's a lot of things that I learned, studying interpersonal relationships that you take home. So I'm assuming you felt like the same with studying in grad school. Did you feel like it really helped you?
Yeah, and I think that's really one of the best parts about a comm degree is like you can directly apply it to your life in so many different ways.
Right.
So that was absolutely true for me. I learned a ton, but I also was able to like put some vocab to some things that I already understood, right? And that was really validating. So I definitely appreciated that. And even now, for teaching classes and thinking about how I explain things, I pull a lot from my personal experience, but also not just in my romantic relationship, but also in parenting and things like that as well.
Right. Yeah, when I'm telling, because there's actually a lot of people, as you know, that don't realize what a communications degree is. Especially it has a little bit of a shitty reputation because it's like the major that a lot of athletes will take because it
sounds easy.
Right? But when I describe it to people, I tell them it's literally a degree that made me a better person, which there's not a lot of different fields. Not that they don't have their own merits, but as far as like just the content itself, not what they're doing later on in life with it.
Yeah,
but
it's
just
so
learning.
Important. Just like in the last 2 weeks, I've gotten tons of requests for different programs, different departments that are like, hey, can you come in and do like an hour lecture on the importance of interpersonal skills, in our field, because it's so important, right? So it's like, I think people are finally starting to understand, like how relevant it is for just, being a good human.
Yes.
Right.
I see it specifically in the workplace. Now that I'm like not in school and I'm mostly work, I just see how it's so bad.
Yeah.
And
people are terrible at it.
Yes.
And what's so fascinating is, especially in those introductory courses, you get students that are like, why do I need to take a class in this? I'm so good at talking to people. Oh, are you?
Yeah.
And how great are your relationships? You may, it's like everybody thinks they're a great listener. No, you're not.
My mom, I know she listens to my podcast, but my mom one time made this comment about, and she probably didn't even know that it bothered me, but about how she learned naturally what I learned in school just through experience, which like a part of that is true. Like it's just humans interacting. So there are things that you just gain. Yeah. But you're not the most effective communicator either, Mom. So it's like there's things that you learn about your own behavior. Like you can self-reflect and be like, oh, kitchen sinking. Yeah. I do that. Yeah. It's like you said, putting a name to things that are happening, especially like stuff like the 4 horsemen and like recognizing.
And the thing is like we can all be better at it.
Right.
And just because I know some stuff and have been teaching it for a while doesn't mean that I am perfect, amazing and perfect all the time. Absolutely not. It's even worse because then I immediately notice it. I'm like, ugh, that was terrible. Yes. Right.
Yeah. And you feel guilty almost being bad at it. Like you don't even have the room to just be like a shitty communicator. You're like,
you have a degree in it. You should be amazing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Right. So what do you feel are some of the biggest misconceptions or stigmas around long distance relationships? Like those major things that people are like, that's why I won't do it.
I think I hear a lot about like that you're lonely all the time, right? Like you're sad and lonely. Like whenever I talk about, my husband being gone, everybody just assumes that I'm like at home crying all the time.
Yeah.
And it's like, I mean, it can be that, right? You can absolutely allow yourself to go there. And I'm not saying that there's zero sadness or zero loneliness, but I think you also can learn to foster that alone time in way more positive and productive ways. So like that's one of the huge benefits of being in a long distance relationship is having that autonomy, right?
Yeah.
To be your own person, to do your own thing, to focus on yourself. I think that's a really big misconception.
Do you feel like you were self-reliant even before this happened and that's why it could have been easier?
I don't know because I was so young, right?
Yeah.
So that is kind of hard for me to piece out. I probably had it in me. But I know I was in a previous relationship where I was like so reliant on my partner, right?
Codependent, kind of.
Mm-hmm. So like in a very unhealthy way, right? And so I think when you're presented with the opportunity and you have the right kind of partner, then you can really start to see how it can be a really great thing to stand on your own 2 feet, to have some time to be by yourself, to self-reflect, to work on yourself, right?
Do you feel like it would be any harder for someone, because like you said, you were really young, so this is kind of all you've ever known. Do you feel like it might be harder for someone who has never known this? Like, let's say if someone who's like 30 years old and is picking this up.
Totally.
Do you think it would be more challenging for them?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it's you have to shift your mindset a little bit, right? So, if you're one of those people that is used to being with your partner, physically being with them every single day and seeing them every single day, that's a big adjustment, right? To be able to still feel close to them and relate to them without physically being in the same space.
Right. What are some of the other things that you hear often about why they're negative or they're bad?
People always worry about infidelity and cheating. So I think a lot of trust issues is a big problem. People always get really worried about that. I think sometimes that can be something that will straight up keep people from being in a long distance relationship. I think that's initially what my husband's problem was. Like he was like, well, you're going away to college. There's going to be so many people that you're going to meet. Like you're going to want to be with those people. Like, why would you want to be with me when I'm not around you? Right. Yeah. And I was like, because I love you. Yeah. Right? Like it just seems so obvious to me.
Right.
And so I think that's a lot of times where people go, right. And their mind is like, oh, but if you're not around me, it's like you're going to forget about me. But then I also think there's that piece of trust where it's like, oh, if I'm not around you, I don't know what you're doing. And you could be doing anything or anyone, right? So I think there's kind of like a couple pieces to the infidelity / trust concerns.
Right. Which I feel like a lot of these things are valid, like they do happen as far as as far as trials and tribulations go in a long distance relationship, like within your own personal relationship and also just in general for anyone who's experienced this type of relationship. What are some of the hardest things about making it work?
Well, I think like the lack of physical touch is huge. Right. So, I think we have always coped pretty well with it, but there certainly are times where you're like, I just want to hug, or I just want to kiss, or I just want to like lay next to you. Right. And there is literally nothing that you can do about that. I think there's a lot of other ways that technology can kind of supplement or, kind of fill in those spots where long distance can be difficult and tricky. And there's like some weird tech where you can like, you have pillows that light up when the other person lays on it, or you have a watch that vibrates every time the other person taps their watch, right? So there's those kinds of things. It's not the same.
Right.
I mean, we know from nonverbal communication, it's just not the same.
It's not like the oxytocin release that you need.
So I think that's a huge one, right? Is that lack of touch.
Right. Which I'll ask you about that later and how you kind of coped with that.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind me asking, like, did you guys ever run into any problems with like infidelity or cheating since you guys have been away from each other for so long?
Yeah, no, we haven't.
Okay.
There's certainly been jealousy. Like we've dealt with jealousy issues, but neither of us have been unfaithful that we know of, that I know of, right?
Right.
But jealousy, I think, is along the same veins, right? And I know I think it was probably the worst for me in like the first 2 years of my undergrad. I actually did a research paper in undergrad about like jealousy and long distance relationships. So I've kind of been researching it forever. But for me, it wasn't a jealousy that like I thought he was going to cheat on me. It was a jealousy of his female friends. So I was most insecure and jealous of the fact that he was hanging out with other girls that he was friends with and like doing fun shit with when I wanted to be there doing fun shit with him. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it was like the really mundane things like going to a movie or like going to have dinner that I knew I just couldn't do. Like I'm just not there. I just can't do those things. And so those were the things that I really struggled with.
So was it more of like a jealousy, because there's a difference between like being jealous of someone getting a job that you want and being jealous of
that's
someone.
envy, right? So like if somebody has something that you want, that's envy. I wish I had that thing.
Right.
Jealousy is like when you feel that there is a perceived threat on one of your close relationships. Right?
So you did feel like a threat that, is he going to develop like an emotional attachment to
Yeah,
him?
I think that's what it was like the companion part of being in a romantic relationship. I felt like, oh, well, he's getting that from someone else.
Okay.
Right? Like if I were there, I would be doing these things with him, but I'm not. So he's doing them with other people.
Which, from what we've researched, women usually get more upset about that sort of infidelity if it were.
Yeah, it's that
happening.
Emotional connection, right?
Right. And one thing that's interesting to me is that I don't know if you have research on this because obviously infidelity and cheating happens in proximal relationships, like where you're living in the same house as somebody.
That's what I was going to say is like, this is not new, right? This is not like unique to long distance relationships. You can see each other every single day and still experience these things. Yeah, totally.
And I don't know if there is research on it happening any more in long distance relationships than it does.
I mean, there might be, and I don't know about it.
Yeah.
I think the difference is with long distance relationships, you have a unique opportunity to experience jealousy in a different way and also express it in a different way. Like we're kind of faced with it in a different way than if you are proximal or around each other all of the time. Like, for example, we see a lot of long distance couples restricting their communication and trying to focus on the good things when they do talk, right? So a lot of folks will avoid conflict because you're not around me, so I don't want to like cause drama. I don't want to get into this, right? So even how they discuss these kinds of things usually happens in different kinds of ways.
Right.
Right.
I wonder if, because I just try to play devil's advocate and see where people are coming from. I wonder if because it might be considered like easier to not get caught if you're in a long distance relationship. So it kind of like bears this question if, if it's easier for you to do it, does it make it like more tempting? And I actually think a lot of research shows the opposite, that the more you're not supposed to do something or the more like there's like tight reins on you, that kind of makes people more inclined to hide things or to do it.
Yeah.
So I'd be
push back, right? So I think, one thing that I would suggest is try not to be super suspicious of your partner,
right? Because
that tends to then, like, again, kind of lead into a self-fulfilling prophecy where, like, if you're constantly asking your partner, like, oh, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? They assume that you don't trust them. And now they're going to behave like you don't trust them. And they're going to give you a reason not to trust them. Right. So it's like you can do all kinds of things like track each other's phones or have each other's passwords. Right. And I, like my husband and I do that, but we never check.
Right.
It's like I have all his passwords, all his stuff, but like I don't care and I never check.
Yeah.
Right. And if I'm tracking his location, it's because like, did he remember to pick up the kids? Which honestly, I'm hoping he does.
Yeah.
It's like about that time right now.
Right.
Right. So it's like, and again, that's not unique for long distance relationships anymore because of technology. So, folks are doing those kinds of things even in proximal relationships.
Right. This is something that I'd probably tap into if I were to go to grad school is, do tight constraints on cheating, make it any less common, which I think I read this book called The State of Affairs by Esther Perel, and it's this, yes, she's great.
Yeah.
It's this book on like all the different sides of cheating, which I've talked about multiple times on the podcast, but it's one of those books you read that really changes your whole perspective, especially if you've been through it, because it goes through the perspective of the person cheating, of the other woman or the other man, which they don't often get thought about. You know, they're just a lot of times portrayed as the villain.
Right.
And then
sometimes they don't even know.
Right. And then obviously like the victim of the infidelity. And it's great because it gives you empathy and compassion for everybody involved.
Right.
Not that it's a healthy or right thing to do. It never is. But it's like really common.
Yeah.
You know? So I've always said this from like a social scientist perspective. You look at that and you're like, why?
Yep.
Why is this happening so much?
Yeah. And I really think like a good way to kind of combat that is to have those open discussions about boundaries and expectations, right?
Right.
Because I think it's interesting, like, what is cheating?
Yeah.
What counts, right? What doesn't? And if you don't have that you don't have that conversation with your partner, how do you expect to be on the same page about it? Because we hear a lot, like, one person getting upset because their partner did something, but the partner didn't feel like that was anything wrong. I don't think I did anything wrong. Well, in my mind, you did. Okay, well, we didn't have that conversation ahead of time, right? So I think that's a really productive, it's a hard, difficult conversation, right, to have. But, you know, you can bring it up in the context of like previous partners. Like, hey, I was in this relationship and this thing happened and I just want to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So I would love to just like have a conversation with you about expectations and what we feel is appropriate for this relationship and what is not. Because my relationship is not your relationship. The way I do things may not work for the way you do things, right? So we have to have those conversations with our partners and really create those expectations together, right? And then you have something to fall back on. Like, hey, man, we had this conversation. Like, you clearly agreed with me that either this was okay or this was not okay, right? And I think that helps us kind of understand the other person's perspective a little bit because it's more of a conversation instead of like, this is what's allowed, this is not what's allowed. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it can be hard because there can be discrepancies between people. And some of those boundaries could be like unhealthy. You know, like for example, if I don't know how you guys ended up working it out, but like if he genuinely just had healthy friendships with other females and there was nothing going on, but it brought him joy, it might be like unhealthy to set a boundary where you going to movies with other girls is cheating.
Right.
You know, I have run into this. I ran into a situation like a few months ago where I was trying to break into like my career field a little bit, and I wanted to do stuff with artist relations, like working like doing PR and managing musicians or musical artists. And I was trying, like I don't want to like be too specific because I really don't know who listens, but I was in a situation where I was friends with the girlfriend of someone who was pretty high up in a record label that I wanted to work for. And I had approached him separately, just kind of saying, hey, like, this is my background. I'd really like to do some work for the label. Can I send you a resume? Yeah. And he had me go through his girlfriend, who's not affiliated with the label in any way.
Because he didn't want to get in trouble, basically?
Exactly. And then it puts me in this weird position because I'm on her personal time now, whenever she gets the time or gets around to it. And it's obviously not a priority for her. So I ended up in a situation where I had to go like around her because it would require me to relocate to a different city. So I needed time to get that together if that was going to be the case. So I reached out to someone else that I knew that knew him because he didn't even give me his email. He didn't give me his phone number. He said, just talk to her.
So he apparently can't even have like professional relationships.
Right. So she found out that I had gone around her and sent me a text. It wasn't rude, but it was blunt and confrontational, basically saying he doesn't work with women like that. He doesn't move with any other woman like that. And it kind of hurt me because we had this conversation about how it's hard for women to be taken seriously and break into the industry.
Right.
And I felt like she was kind of propagating that message. That the reason why women don't do well is because they're sexualized. In my eyes, that's a way of sexualizing me.
Yeah, totally.
Because it has nothing to do...
Because you're obviously a problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's, to me...
Well, it's like couples who share social media accounts. Please. Yeah. You can't even have your own social media account? Right. Do you share email addresses too? Yeah. Like, that's ridiculous. Right. Right. So I think you have to... Right. And so I agree. You can come up with some crazy ass boundaries. And I would never say that those kinds of things are effective, right? And I think those kinds of things might feel good in the moment to set up, like, oh, I'll just read all your emails. That'll solve it. No, it's not going to, right? Long-term wise, like, that's not going to be a healthy thing at all. You have to be able to trust each other ultimately, right? You can't just having access to everything that your partner does not equal trust.
Right.
Trust is, I don't feel like I even need to look.
Right.
I forget that I have your password. Right.
So in situations like that, like, the infidelity isn't even the problem. Like, it hasn't happened. It's non-existent. Right. The problem is the underlying distrust. And even if you do all these things and have all these rules, I feel like that comes out eventually.
Totally. Yeah.
No matter what.
I agree.
And that's in a proximal relationship.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that can happen in other kinds of relationships too. Family relationships, friendships, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it stems from our own insecurities.
Right.
Right. So we can get into all of the psychology of it, and all the self-awareness and all the things. But ultimately, I think the trust really comes from when you believe, right, the things that your partner says. You believe that there is truth and honesty in how they feel about you, and you don't question that.
Right.
And you also believe that you deserve it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We kind of went on our little tangent there. No, you're good. So do you feel like because he was in the military that added like a different layer? Because people are long distance for a variety of reasons, So do you think him being in the military made it harder to do the long distance or easier? Was he
yes and no.
fighting, or did he do something
no? So
else?
his job was, for the most part, he was like working on the planes. So he wasn't like out and about like shooting people. But he still went some places that were pretty dangerous, so that was a little scary. I think one of the big issues with long distance relationships in the military is that the military creates this and perpetuates this kind of culture of infidelity. So, people who are in the military and married know that so many people cheat. It's crazy.
Really? I didn't know.
Really, really bad. Yeah. And so then once we were married and in the military together and hung out with other married couples, I started to realize like how bad it was. And I think, unfortunately, people kind of assume, if I'm TDY, if I'm sent somewhere or I'm deployed somewhere to work, like it's like out of sight, out of mind. And it's kind of rampant, just like everybody's having sex with everybody. It's crazy.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah. And it's really disappointing. And it was very disappointing for me to kind of hear like friends talk about that. But what I think kind of like influences that is that you make more money in the military when you're married. So a lot of folks will get married for no reason other than to have money. So they'll find a friend or someone that they're casually dating. Let's get married. If they're both in the military, that's even better, right? Everybody's making more money. And then you don't really care about that person. So then you deploy and then you just have sex with whoever you want because it doesn't really matter anyway. Doesn't mean feelings aren't getting hurt, right? And a lot of times there's kids involved too, which makes it even more difficult. So I think it comes down to the unfortunate fact that folks get paid more money to be married. And I remember being a girlfriend of a military member that you don't matter at all, right? So like I couldn't fly over there and move in with him and live with him until we were married. I needed to be on his orders, right, to even exist, really, because then you're in the family, right? It's like this big club you got to join. But if you're just dating, even if you've been together for 20 years, you don't matter in the eyes of the military, right? And so I think that really creates a lot of problems and a lot of really unhealthy relationships.
Did hearing about like other people who were close to you deal with that issue make you like second guess it at all in your own relationship?
No, but one of the kind of like expectations that we had set in our relationship is that he was not going to be in the military for life. Otherwise, I would not have married him. So a lot of folks that join the military are in for 20 years, right? They want to retire. It's great benefits. But I very clearly let him know if he went in for 6. If you're in for more than 6, then we can't be together. Because again, it was that autonomy, right? I have my own education and career to think about. And when you are married to someone in the military, you have zero control over where you go, where you live, what you're doing. You just kind of drug along. And I didn't want that kind of life. I wanted more control over what I was doing, which is why we came to Vegas. So the deal was, I'm moving to Germany for your job, and then I get to choose where we go after this. And I wanted to come here for grad school, and that's where we ended up. And then we ended up both loving it. We're from Southern California, so we're not too far away from both of our families, which is really nice. We're the only ones that left.
Yeah. Okay. So did you basically say that you didn't want to commit? Because you guys obviously did the long distance thing and loved it. So you basically said you don't want to do the long distance thing for like the rest of your life.
It was, I don't want, well,
because you guys, if you didn't follow him, right? Because I guess you would have the option to stay wherever you wanted to, like if he was still there.
Yeah.
And moved.
So in our mind, we weren't going to be long distance forever, which I think is so common for most people who are in long distance relationships, is they believe it's going to be temporary. I think that's a lot of folks like fall back and have that comfort of like, it's only 6 months. It's only a year. It's only until I graduate. It's only until, we're done with this job or whatever. I would say most long distance couples are not doing it thinking that that's going to be their entire life. And I think that's really interesting too, because I think that can be really good, right? Like, why not? Why is it not okay for a married couple to live in 2 different homes, to be in 2 different states, 2 different countries? Why is that not acceptable, right? Everybody would assume there's something going on, right? Like there's a problem in the relationship if you're doing that.
Right.
And so I would definitely want to challenge that idea. Why is this not okay?
Right.
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 It's more common in folks who, like if you have 2 married folks who both make a lot of money and are in really important careers, it's more common for them to both prioritize their own careers, which then ultimately means that they may have to live in different places, and then that's okay. And that might not be temporary. Back in the day, that used to be called commuter marriages.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I feel like it's getting more common because of how advanced technology has become, so it's not as scary. It's not like, we're writing letters to people and like waiting weeks to hear back from them, things like that. Like people are at our fingertips still. Yeah. Physical touch thing's big. But as far as like communicating, like, and because there's definitely, moving like in like the women's rights movement and feminism and stuff like that, I feel like there's more and more women who are, whereas maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, it was more common for like the woman to not really prioritize her job as much. It's becoming more common for there to be like dual parent households where both of them are like they're relying on an income from both parents or like the both spouses. So I think that that's going to become more and more common.
Yeah, and I printed out because I wanted to make sure that I mentioned it. The census data shows that in 2000, the number of married Americans 18 and older that reported they were living apart from their spouse in the year 2000 was 2.7 million people, which is a lot.
That is a lot.
Right? It rose to 3.9 million people in 2017. So, I mean, that number is going up and up and up. So it's becoming more common, right? And I think for all those reasons that you said, as well as technology advancements, right? So there's a lot of reasons why people are doing it more often.
Right.
I mean, in our early days of long distance, like early 2000s, like we had cell phones and they were terrible. We never used them.
Yeah.
Right? They were unreliable. We would email. We would send stuff in the mail, send letters. We would IM, right? Like AOL Instant Messenger. We would do that. But for the most part, we didn't have the ability to like FaceTime and all of that. But those kinds of heavy reliance on technology, I warn people not to do, actually, because that can be actually detrimental to your relationship to kind of to overdo it, right? So I think
then it's not doesn't feel long distance,
right? And you're missing out on that amazing benefit of having that autonomy. So if you are, and I've seen people constantly attached to their phone, can't stop texting their partner all day long. Or people that will put on like FaceTime or Skype or whatever, like in the background of their home with each other and just like have it on or like fall asleep to FaceTime. That's not healthy.
Yeah.
Right? Now that comes across as being like super needy and you can't possibly go a second without each other. And honestly, like who can keep that up?
Yeah.
Who can do that every day forever? Right? Like I wouldn't want to.
Yeah.
So when you start those kinds of habits, it's very difficult to maintain. And I think it just ultimately comes across as like just way too needy and codependent. Like you need to be able to have your own life.
Yeah. Is there like a healthy amount of technology that you would say you feel works?
I think that varies by, couple. It really depends on like your schedules. I mean, you've got things to consider like, are you in different time zones? Sometimes you have to schedule, like we would have to schedule phone calls because he would often be 9-10 hour time difference than me, right? So it's trying to just coordinate in those capacities, especially after like we had our son. Like if you want to see Miles on FaceTime, he's got to be awake, right? Like you've got to kind of coordinate all these different things. So I don't think that there's like a number of, how many texts you should send in a day or whatever. But you want to be able to have a balance to where you like actually enjoy it. So when it starts to become a chore and you're like, wow, I haven't looked at my phone in 20 minutes and I have 9,000 text messages, and it becomes like annoying and a burden. That's when I think you're hitting into that kind of like dangerous territory.
Yeah, the threshold.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that, I know you've talked about it before in class too, that once he moved back here, that it was actually hard for you guys to adjust to. What was that like? Why was it hard?
Yeah, so that's another thing that I think folks are not really prepared for and often like do wrong is thinking that, oh, well, when we're not long distance, everything's going to be magical. Like we just need to live together. That's all we need, right? And then you're not prepared for how crazy different that is. And then it's a nightmare. Right. So you have to transition into being around each other. And for some folks, that can take a couple of weeks. It can take a couple of months, right? Because now you're around each other all the time. And we know that you have the most conflict with the people that you're around the most.
Right.
So you may have gone from having like very little conflict to having conflict all the time because you're in each other's faces, right? You lose that sweet, sweet autonomy, right? Where it's like, oh, I used to be able to go hang out with my friends or watch the shows I want to watch or, work on my own projects or whatever. Now you're in my face and we have to do everything together. So like, there goes my autonomy, right?
Right.
And so people really struggle during this time. And so they're not prepared for it. So I would say like, expect it, right? And then be like gentle with each other during that time. So anytime that he would come home from a deployment, we would have to ease into kind of being around each other. One of the big challenges is if you're raising kids, right? Like the parent that stayed with the kid knows everything. You have been gone. You thought you knew some stuff. Well, things have changed and you actually know nothing. So don't come back and expect to just take over, right? Because it's very disrespectful for the person that has been thriving by themselves and making it happen, right? So we very quickly understood, like, you have to ease in. You have to, like, kind of get to know me and get to know your kid again, right? And it's not to say that that's a bad thing. That doesn't mean that, like, we don't love you, we don't care about you. It's literally we're just used to not being around you. And so we need to adjust again, right? So you have to be, like, considerate and understanding and also know that, like, there's going to be conflict and that's okay. So you fall back on those conflict management skills and do your best, right? Try to manage your emotions. Don't lose your mind. And also don't like catastrophize. Like, oh my God, we're not meant to be together. We should break up. This is terrible. This is a horrible idea. Why did I move here for you? Right? Like, calm down. This is what it's like to be in a relationship. Like, stuff is hard, right? You have to be able to have the hard conversations, do the hard things to make it work.
Was that hard for him? Like, do you know if he ever vocalized that he felt like kind of like an outsider in his own family?
Totally. He would get really sad sometimes. But I think, luckily for us, like he trusts my ability to communicate, right? He's always kind of let me lead how we communicate when things are hard and trusted in, and I think that's a big part of like why we're successful is like we know each other's strengths, right? And it's like, this is your area. So I'm going to like defer to you on this because I know that you have the best intentions, right, of the relationship. And so I know it was hard, but it was also really hard being away. So it's like being away is hard, right? Coming back is hard. But then you get into the groove of things, right? And then it's not so hard.
Yeah.
And so over years we started to figure it out.
Right. It reminds me of just because in the last year, I've lived with 3 different roommates. So I lived with 2 roommates this last year, and then I just moved in to a new place with a different roommate. And it reminds me of just like getting used to living with somebody and their habits because you know them obviously on a very intimate level, but knowing like their idiosyncrasies and if they leave like the toothpaste all bunched up at the top of the thing or they're really loud when they come home at night or
do they immediately wash their dishes or do they leave them in the sink for a while?
Right. So
they throw their shoes like when they walk in the room.
Yeah. And it's hard to adjust to that in general, let alone to go from living by yourself and then having to adjust to somebody again.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, when you really think about it, it's crazy that people assume like, oh, let's just live together. That'll solve everything. Like, are you kidding me? That's hard. Period. That's hard.
Well, it reminds me of like when people think having a kid
oh, God.
fix it.
That'll fix everything. It's like the hardest thing you can do, right?
Yeah, the biggest strain that you can put on your relationship is having to like raise a whole other human when you don't even have your relationship worked out yet. And then that's why so many people have abandonment issues and trauma they have to work through as adults. So like therapy is definitely going to be a hot market forever.
Absolutely.
Forever.
Yeah, and it's funny because, once you have kids, like now you're modeling your communication for them.
Right.
So it's really interesting because my son is 10 now and he's been in a long distance relationship for a year.
Really?
And how we define long distance relationship is you don't see each other every day, right? And so they only live like, I don't know, 15 miles away from each other, but they only see each other maybe once a month. And so he was the one, I believe you self-define, right? If you feel like you're in a long distance relationship, you are. Nobody can tell you that you are or not. It's not a number of miles apart or whatever. And he's like, yeah, I'm in a long distance relationship. It's like, are you sure you want to do that? You're pretty young. He's like, Mom, if you can do it, I can do it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's cute.
Yeah.
Do you feel like being in a long distance relationship has like increased your ability to make your relationship work on a normal day? Or like, in other words, do you feel like working through that situation gave you a skill set that you wouldn't otherwise have had you not been in a long distance relationship?
Yeah, I think so. I think for a lot of reasons, right? I think with long distance relationships, they often rely on technology and online communication. And we know that we self-disclose like deeper and faster when we're communicating in those ways. So I think you get to know each other like on a really deep level that sometimes, you get into things that sometimes, people who are in proximal relationships, it takes them forever to really get to. So, and then I think you also like you have to deal with tough emotions. You have to, handle like hard conversations. And those are all really important skills that we need in all of our relationships. So, trying to be vulnerable with each other and know that it's okay to talk about those things, I think is a great skill. And so, yeah, in a long distance relationship, that stuff's going to come up or it won't, and you're just going to break up.
Yeah.
Right. So there's that too.
Right.
But I think that it gave us a lot of important skills. And also I think it taught us a lot about ourselves.
Right.
As people, as communicators, as individuals. Yeah.
Well, because you guys have like that space to just like be who you are without the other person. Totally. It's like the definition of them like complementing your life. You don't need them, but they're adding something to your life that wouldn't be there.
Yeah. I don't need you, but I want you.
Right. I wonder if because I know it's not as common with like my generation and like the generations that are coming up, but more like my parents' generation and before them, obviously my grandparents were together for 40 years. I think it's more common to just be with like your high school sweetheart. You see it more in their generations.
And it's funny because I tell my kids, like, do not do this.
Yeah.
Do not marry your high school sweetheart.
Why do you tell them that?
Because I know that it's rare for it to work.
Right.
Like most 16, 17-year-olds are not in the right state of mind and don't know enough about themselves to even know if this person is someone that they should be spending the rest of their life with, right? I think we grew up together and really learned about ourselves and about relating in a positive way, and so it worked out. But I understand that is not common, right?
Right.
Like I would want them to explore a little bit more and to really do some deep diving about yourself, right? Figure yourself out before you are ready to commit to someone else.
Well, if you're saying, that it is possible I feel like it's basically like saying like, how bad do you want it to work?
Yeah.
Don't you trust that they would be able to like figure that out if they want?
Yeah, I mean, I also don't think my son should be in a relationship at 10 years old, but here we are, right? I mean, he's gonna make up his own mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, like you're gonna figure it out.
Right. Obviously, like I said, I've been with my boyfriend since high school. And and I'm not gonna like divulge too much just because like there's obviously another person a part of like this information, so just like sharing as little as I can. It's been, you know, really hard because those first years, you know, me being in them now, like from the time that you're a teenager till whatever, you're like your 30s, you're still like developing an identity, like figuring out who you are.
Yeah.
And I've struggled a lot, like just my personal experience, because I'm very autonomous, like very self-reliant.
Yeah.
I need a lot of space. I'm super independent. Ironically, I'm also very codependent. And we kind of noticed that that was becoming an issue recently, that we were sort of codependent on each other, which confuses me because I am so independent.
Right, so it's like, how is this possible?
Yeah. But I have struggled because sometimes I feel like, do I know who I am separate from this person? And it becomes like overwhelming because you love this person and you've developed like a really deep connection with them and they're important to you, but it's also like they're all you've ever known.
Yeah.
So it's like I have this enmeshed identity with him, and I don't feel like that's, you know, super healthy. It's just all these hard boundaries that are really difficult to manage because you're supposed to be super intimate and close and relate to your partner, but where's that line between enmeshed and healthy?
Yeah,
you know?
but you shouldn't rely on them to, you know, define who you are.
Right.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And my husband and I have kind of talked about it in a way of like, I would never want to do life with anyone else, right? So if you die, that's it. Right. I would rather be alone, right? Like that's kind of how we have talked about our relationship is like, I feel like we'll never get divorced. That's not going to happen. The only way that we would be apart is it literally if one of us died, right?
Right.
And however, I know I would be okay, right? Like, obviously, I want you to live. I want you in my life. I want to be with you. You are a huge part of my life, right? But I know I will be okay.
Do you think that the long distance stuff made that thought possible
Totally.
for you?
Yeah, because here's the thing. So I think long distance is super healthy. I also think every relationship needs elements of distance, right? I think we all need to get out of each other's faces and spend some time alone for the benefit of ourselves, for the benefit of the relationship, right?
Right.
And I think long distance will teach you so much about who you are as a person and also the relationship, right? So if I'm never away from him, I have no idea if I can even do it. But I have been away from him and I can do it, right? And you don't know that until you actually put yourself in that position.
Right.
So so now, he has a job that is in Vegas. I work in Vegas. We live in the same house. It's been this way for like 5-6 years now. But we still like to do things without each other. It's very important for me to like have moments with my friends. I will take trips without him to go visit my friends, right? He takes trips to go on races. He goes to like Mexico and races in Baja for like 2 weeks at a time. Have a good time. I love you. I miss you. Have a great time. I'll see you when you're back. And it's also really interesting because we don't talk a lot when we're away from each other. Like, we're not one of those couples that's texting all the time. We'll get in maybe a phone call once or twice.
Yeah.
But like, you're coming back. I'll see you. I know you're having a good time. I don't want to bother you. Like, do your thing. It's really about like fostering yourself as a person, right? And also your other relationships. My other relationships are very important to me. I need to be able to see my friends and to see my other family members and to form relationships with them, like without my husband being around me all the time. You know?
Right. Yeah. That's one of the things that we kind of just figured out through experience is that it's almost like this involuntary ultimatum where it's like we either have space or we break up. Like that's what the alternative is at this point. And it's not that we're not compatible or that we don't love each other. It's not a lack of anything. No. It's just like we just hit this point where we kind of agreed mutually that we were like, all right, we're going to only talk to each other a few times a month. And that's what we do now. Is the other weeks that we're not together or it's like not our scheduled days, we don't talk at all. I love it. We don't like, it's not like we're broken up.
Right, you're not broken up.
And all of that. But basically, if he sees, it's an exercise in trust too, because if he sees that I'm out, because I work at a day club, so there's a lot of times where, we'll go out or we'll do something. It's trusting that I don't need to say anything. You don't need to call me. You don't need to message me. Trusting that nothing is going on. So it builds that element, and then having all of this free time to not have to check in with anybody. Like if it's a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, someone invites me out, I'm going out.
Yeah.
And I'm not checking in. I don't have to plan around anybody. And that's been really nice. And I, know that he probably feels the same way because it's something that we've done for like months now, since like April.
I love that.
And so when you're talking about like space and distance and things like that, like it's been like kind of saved us in a way, because you just naturally hit points in a relationship where you ask like, okay, what are we getting out of this? Is this worth our time and our energy? Are we, we had hit this point where it's like, it feels like we're both giving more than we're taking. Like we're not getting what we should out of this relationship. So what are we going to do? Because I didn't not want to be with him. It's just been this, relationships are complicated.
Oh God, so complicated.
I don't know what I'm doing. I didn't know what I was doing. Like we both kind of mutually came up with this thing, and people have a lot to say about it.
Oh, I'm sure they do. Yeah. Because people think that distance is a terrible thing.
Yeah.
It's
and they're like, that's
bad thing.
Weird. The main thing is like, that's weird. You guys have an arrangement. That's weird. Like you're 23, you're 24, like just break up. Like why are you doing this? Blah, 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 blah. Like,
because you see value in the relationship and the other person.
People don't understand. So it discourages me from talking about it.
Right, I get that.
Because
and it also gives you a chance to miss each other.
Right.
Get the fuck out of my face for a little while and I will miss you.
Yeah.
And that is great. Yeah. Missing someone and then being able to be reunited with them is incredible. And that's something that's literally built into long distance relationships, is you have that time apart, that chance to miss each other. And then that great, like, passionate reunion. And then that's fucking fantastic, right? Like, that's great.
We didn't really know what to expect, but it just ended up being, like, the days that we did see each other, we wanted to do things together. Like, we didn't want to just sit at home. Right. Like, some days it's like that, but for the most part, it's like, okay, it's more intentional, the time that you spend together versus, when someone is there all the time, you're just, like, on your phone and they're next to you. And
what's
it's
the point?
Like normal.
I mean, you take each other for granted in that capacity.
For sure.
And that's, I think that long distance, and really what long distance is, can really be you live in the same city, right? Maybe you're even on opposite shifts, like especially in a town like Vegas. There were a lot of times where he would be here, even almost the whole time that he was a contractor. When he was in Vegas, not deployed, he was on night shift and I worked days. So in my mind, we were still long distance, because we weren't even sleeping at the same times, right? So we would see each other on our days off, and that was it. Yeah. So, like, you can live in the same house as someone and still basically be in a long-distance relationship, right? It's relating in those same ways.
Right. We don't live together, and he works nights, and I work days.
Yeah.
So and the days that we do see each other, it's on our days off anyways. But it's... I guess by definition, then I would be. I would
classify that as long distance. And even if you live together, just because you're on opposite shifts, you still wouldn't see each other that much, right?
Right. Yeah. So, I guess what is it? Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Saying there's some truth to it, for sure. So what does the research say about like the good things you can do to make long distance relationships work? I mean, I assume that it can't be much different than how you make any other type of relationship work as far as communication and stuff, but is there anything like that's specific or unique about long distance?
Well, we've talked a lot about autonomy. I think that's a huge one. I think like starting to shift how you really think about what distance means is also a big one. So really thinking positively about what are some of the benefits, in research in regards to, our interpersonal relationships, there's things we call maintenance strategies. So we've talked about them a lot in classes, and the maintenance strategies that are recommended for, proximal romantic relationships and close friendships and family relationships are the same for long distance. Sometimes you just have to use technology to kind of make those things happen, right? So making sure that you're self-disclosing and you're talking about what's going on with you, being open, with your partner, providing assurances where you reassure them, I love you, I care about you, right? Like openly communicating those things Integrating your social networks, that's another big one. So having, your partner know who your friends are and have relationships with those people as well, and your family members, and then you doing the same for your partner's people. Like, that's really important. Something that's worked really well for us is like our families are totally enmeshed now because we've been together over 20 years. But like, my parents always loved him, right? And my little brother and his little sister happen to be the same age and the same grade. And so, our siblings know each other. He's actually closer to my little brother now than I ever was. So that's really cool. So it's really like integrating your social networks is a major benefit. So all of these things that we consider to be positive strategies for any kind of relationship are equally as important in long distance relationships. You just may have to use technology to do those things, right?
One of the things that you mentioned earlier that I'm wondering how you guys, like, maybe not even you personally, but if there is research on how to make this work, is like emotional needs and things like that, and staying in touch with who somebody is and just having face-to-face time, I feel like is, more possible now because of the technology and all the different ways that you can access somebody. But like managing those physical needs within a relationship, sexual needs too, obviously, like there's not a lot that you can do if your partner's out there. How do you make that work? Well,
I would say you do need to see each other occasionally, right? So I think the hardest times for my husband and I were the times when he was deployed, because he would be gone for like 6 months at a time. Whereas when we were dating in college, and most of the time he was in Washington, which was like a drive. I could drive there. We could see each other, right? We would try to spend a weekend together every like 5-6 weeks. And that really became like the perfect amount of time away from each other. And you could see each other for a couple of days, and it would hold you over until those other 5-6 weeks. So I would say like do what you can to actually be together, like relatively regularly if possible, right? So scheduling those visits if you can. I know those things cost money. It can be very difficult. It can be difficult to get time apart, or like time away from your job or whatever, time off. But like that should be a priority. You don't have to see each other every weekend, but you need to try and make it happen, as often as you possibly can. And then like for, time away and sex and stuff like that, like get creative, right? Yeah. Like you can send photos, you can FaceTime. There's all kinds of things you can do. Right. And I think that also is great when you can really just like let go of some of those boundaries and be creative with each other. And I think that was something that worked really well for us, was again, because we were so young, that we kind of like figured those things out together, right? So you're not only figuring out, sexual needs, but you're also figuring out, how do we do this when we're not around each other, right? Like, how do I do this long distance? So like get creative. I mean, there's so many, like the technology is insane, right? Like, when I think about like us being apart in the early 2000s, I mean, it was literally like there's no sexting because there's no texting.
Right.
And cameras were literally like cameras, right? Yeah. Like, I mean, you can get creative, dig deep, get creative, make it happen. And I think those things can often kind of hold you over until you can be together again.
Right. So what advice would you give to anyone thinking of embarking on a journey like this? Like, what's the most important piece?
I would say work on your comm skills, right? Work on your like conflict management, your emotion management, your own self-awareness. Work on being very clear with your partner about what you want, right? And making sure you're paying attention to what the other person wants. I would say also be like understanding, right? And accepting. So understand like, okay, it gets easier over time. So the beginning part can be like real tricky, right? Until you kind of get into a groove and figure it out. And I would say try to like abandon some of those common perceptions of distance and being away from each other, and really try to shift your mindset to think about the good things. So focus on the positive. That's something that I talk about a lot in class, is like focus on the good things. What are the good things, right? If I find out my husband is going to leave for 6 months and leave me at home with a baby, what's the good thing about that? Dig deep, right? Right. There are some good things, and then focus on those things.
Okay. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to add that I didn't already cover?
I don't think so. Yeah, don't expect that transitioning, if you're long distance, that moving in together is going to magically fix everything, because it's definitely not.
Right.
And burst your bubble real quick.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
I
this is
appreciate
fun.
it. Thank you for your time and your expertise. If any of you guys have any more questions for Jenny or would like to continue this conversation, I will have her contact information available on my YouTube channel. Thank you all for tuning in this week, and I will see you again soon to talk more elephants.